All right, welcome back to connective tissues onto bone. All right, so in a lot of ways, we're going to see similar setup in bone that we saw in cartilage. So again, we're going to see these little cells. In this case, they're called osteocytes. They're also going to be in a space. It's also called a lacuna. And they're also producing this matrix, and it'll have collagen fibers as well as this, well, in this case, calcified ground substance. So I think we all know bone protects things, right? We have bones that are covering our, right underneath the skin in our chest, helps protect our heart, our lungs, our brain, right? Provides movement. If we didn't have bones, all of our muscles would just end up making us kind of move like worms. So thankfully our bones, muscles can pull on them. We have these nice big movements that we're so familiar with. Helps store minerals. One of the biggest ones is going to be calcium. We're going to see later on how important calcium is in muscle contractions. It'll also be important in nerve signaling, as well as clotting cascade, a bunch of other stuff. So you'll see calcium come up a little bit later on 201 as well as 202. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, in bone cells blood cells are formed in red bone marrow. So I think we talked about leukemia in a previous chapter. So basically, again, as in the adult, all of our bone cells are being formed in bones, particularly long bones. Again, as I had mentioned, instead of chondrocytes that we saw in cartilage, we now have osteocytes. So now you see osteo, it's referring to bone. Okay. So we can have either spongy bone, so basically it looks like a sponge, hence we call it spongy bone. Okay. Or we can have compact bone, which is just solid, dense bone. The basic unit of a compact bone is an osteon. We'll get a lot more into that, sort of in this upcoming, after this first exam, when we actually talk about bones. We'll talk quite a bit about osteons and bones more specifically. But just as a little bit of kind of recap from what you saw in lab. So here we have an osteon, so this is part of compact bone. So in the center you have the central or Haversian canal. And each one of these rings of matrix around it is called a lamellae. So you have many different lamellae. You can really think of that like the rings around a tree, right? Very similar to that. So again, in the central canal, this is where we have all of our blood vessels. So these cells in these in the lacunae, in the spaces. So here on this kind of blown up image, we see this blue cell. And that little space that it's in is a lacunae, or lacuna. And so basically, this cell somehow has to get nutrients from that Haversian canal, or central canal, as well as get waste to it. So it's got to have an exchange with the blood vessel. So basically, these cells are kind of really weird looking. They have these very long appendages that kind of stick out. And because they're surrounded by bone, the only way they can stick out is if they have like little tiny tunnels. So that's what you see. So you can kind of see all these little tiny little stripes almost. And those are the canaliculi. Those are these tiny little canals. What's its name? Canaliculi, like little canals. Going from into that Haversian canal. Okay, so these cells can then exchange nutrients and waste with that blood vessel. So again, lamellae are just rings of mineralized matrix. The lacunae, the spaces, contain osteocytes. Oh, I'm not going to hide my image here. So canaliculi are tiny canals that allow routes for nutrient and waste transport. And again, that central canal contains blood vessels. Liquid connective tissue, talking about blood really, and the liquid matrix is called plasma. There are some formed elements, so those are things like cells and things like that. The other type of liquid connective tissue is lymphatic fluids. So any fluid that basically is, you either have sort of two different types. They'll either be in a blood vessel, in which case it is blood. However, fluid is going to leak out of that blood vessel into that interstitial space, that space surrounding cells. So cells can get nutrients and stuff from the blood vessel, and otherwise how do they get it? It leaks out. Most of that fluid that leaks out of blood vessels gets reabsorbed back into blood vessels. However, a little bit doesn't, and it's going to be the job of lymph vessels, so this other category of, other type of vessel, that will reabsorb that extra little bit of fluid. When they are unable to, you end up having edema. That's swelling, right? So if you have too much fluid leaking out into that interstitial space, that space between the cells, you get swelling and edema. I'm trying to move my image here. The other thing lymphatic fluid is going to do is certain things are too large to get actually in your blood vessels. So these will pick, lymphatic vessels will actually pick those things up and transport them. So lipids from the diets, when your digestive tract breaks down fats and reabsorbs them, those fats can't actually go directly into your bloodstream. They actually go into the lymphatic system, and then they eventually get reinserted into these larger these larger blood vessels, sort of up here by your neck, by your collarbones. It's also where, again, cancer cells, when they break off, sometimes they're too large to necessarily travel in the bloodstream, so they'll travel via the lymphatic system. And as I mentioned to you guys earlier, sometimes they'll get stuck in lymph nodes. So that's why if there's a cancer in a certain area, they'll also look at the lymph nodes just upstream from that to see if maybe those cancer cells have traveled, and they're stuck there, so they'll just take them out just to be on the safe side. Elephantiasis is a horrible condition. So if you take a look at this image, this is one of the first known images of an individual with elephantiasis, and that doesn't mean it hasn't existed for a very long time. This is just the first photograph of a person with it. So you can kind of see from the waist up, she looks very healthy and normal, I guess, but then from the waist down, you see like it's really these deformed legs. What elephantiasis is there are parasites that can infect the body through mosquito bites, and they destroy those lymphatic vessels. So as I mentioned to you earlier, those lymphatic vessels take up that excess interstitial fluid, right? So all that fluid that's in the spaces somewhere between blood vessels and cells. When you destroy those lymphatic vessels, you get edema, 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 edema. You see where I'm going with this? Swelling, 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 swelling. So you end up damaging the tissues around it. The tissues are more prone to infections, fungal infections, all sorts of things. So that's what elephantiasis is. Basically, again, a parasite destroys the lymphatic vessels in a body, in a region. So as you can see, it's in her legs. It's not affecting other areas. It's just in her legs. And then that ends up causing massive edema and swelling. And that's just the point of deformity. So blood, you have different types of cells. Let me move my image again. Actually, you know what? I'll just get rid of it for now. So cells are going to be red blood cells. Our fancy biology word for them are erythrocytes, and that's what we'll refer to them as. White blood cells are called leukocytes, and then you have cell fragments, which are platelets. So in this image, you see here are two of the same leukocyte. Here's a little platelet, and then here's a erythrocyte. Let me just kind of go back a quick second. So the main job here, red blood cells are going to transport oxygen to and from cells. So that is their main job. So red blood cells transport oxygen to and from cells. Leukocytes, on the other hand, these guys are there for immune protection. So the leukocytes provide immune protection. And then platelets, and you'll learn a different term for this in 202, they're also called thrombocytes. Think of like thrombosis, so thrombocytes. So platelets will help stop bleeding. That's their job. So red blood cells transport oxygen primarily. White blood cells are there for immune function, and platelets to stop bleeding. All right. So membranes. These are flat sheets of tissue that cover or line parts of the body. We've already seen these, or some of these I should say. We have different types. We have mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membrane, that's your skin. Something's cutaneous membrane. You also have something called a synovial membrane. And those will line joints, and we'll talk quite a bit more about the synovial membranes when we actually get to joints. All right, so let's talk about mucous membranes. So the mucous membranes are going to line areas that are open to the exterior, mouth, stomach, vagina, urethra, right? So the other thing with mucous membranes is that it's reasonably easy for certain sick, illness-causing bacteria to get across them. So it's one of the reasons why we tell people, like, all right, wash your hands. You know, do not put things in your mouth. Even in your eye, you'll have mucous membranes, so don't rub your eyes. Don't pick your nose. Those kinds of things, because you can transfer infections, you know, even viruses, very easily across mucous membranes. One thing I will say about mucous membranes before we start on serous membranes is that mucus will help trap a lot of particles. So where stuff does get across, some other things, it is, you know, fairly effective at keeping like pollen and stuff like that from getting across into your body, into your bloodstream. Okay. We've talked about serous membranes before in chapter 1. So what we talked about the pleura, the peritoneum, and the pericardium. So we had the visceral and the parietal layers, right? So if they lined the walls of the cavity, they were the parietal layers. So parietal pleura if it lined the lung, like the chest cavity. Parietal peritoneum if it lined the abdominal cavity. Parietal pericardium is the sac that the heart sat in. When it's on the actual organ itself, we call that the visceral layer. So visceral pleura, visceral peritoneum, visceral pericardium. Right. So here's just, again, so here's just another example of that. And the key thing too is that in between that parietal and visceral pleura, we do have a fluid, and that helps keep everything nice and slippery, and it keeps things from sticking to one another. So cutaneous membrane is simply the skin. We're going to have an entire chapter devoted to skin, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, just very brief sort of foreshadowing kind of details. Sorry, I keep skipping ahead. So when we talk about the skin, what we're going to be talking about is the epidermis as well as the dermis. Those are the two layers of your skin. The subcutaneous is not part of your skin. Keep that in mind now. It's a common mistake that people make. Again, major function of your cutaneous layer is for protection. Protection from abrasions, protection from microbes. Again, things like, I mean, think about it, just like a second ago, I was telling you that the mucous membranes things get across. And that's true, you know that. That's why we always tell people, wash your hands, wash your hands. Because as long as it stays on the surface of your skin, you can wash it off and you're not going to get sick. As soon as you start biting your fingernails, or rubbing your eye, again, your nose, other body orifices, now things can get transmitted across. So your cutaneous membrane is very effective at keeping things, infections and stuff like that, out of your body. Right. So here's an example of a synovial membrane. So here are two bones, and these can be, really you can think of most very movable joints having synovial membranes. So things like your knuckles and the bones of your fingers and stuff like that, your shoulder, your knee, your ankle, all of those will have synovial membranes. And so what you see here is you have the two different bones that are coming together. There's a little bit of cartilage in between them, and they are basically encapsulated in a capsule. And lining the capsule are these what are known as synoviocytes. Okay, and simply these synoviocytes produce synovial fluid. And that fluid is a nice lubricating fluid that also acts as a shock absorber, as well as provides nutrients to the cartilage in these joints. And again, this cartilage would be hyaline cartilage. All right. So going on to muscle tissues. So basically these muscle cells, they're there to provide motion, help you maintain your posture, and heat. So we don't necessarily think of it that way all the time, but you know how it is. Like if you're cold, what do? You shiver, right? Because shivering produces heat. You start working out, you go on a treadmill, your muscles are moving, you get hot, you start to sweat, right? So the actions of muscles produce heat. You have 3 different types: skeletal, cardiac, smooth. Again, I'm just going to introduce these to you in very brief terms right now. We will spend a much more detail on them a little bit later on this semester. All right, so the first type is skeletal muscle. So these cells are long, they're cylindrical. They're actually, when you're developmentally, so as you're developing, as you're growing inside the womb, you have different cells that kind of come together and fuse into one. And so a single skeletal muscle cell is actually the product of many different cells having fused together, and now they become one. So you have many different nuclei, which really is weird when you think about it. Most other cells of your body, it's one nucleus per cell. And again, in muscles, you have many nuclei for one cell. Long, cylindrically shaped. You've seen this underneath the microscope. There are these light dark bands that you will see. We'll talk a little bit more about how they occur a bit later on in the semester. And they're voluntary. Your skeletal muscles move because you tell them to. Obviously, you can have situations where you have some muscle spasms and things like that. However, you are controlling your skeletal muscles. Cardiac muscles, on the other hand, are branched, meaning they're not cylinders. They have all these dividers kind of going to these weird irregular shapes to them. However, they follow that one cell, one nucleus rule. Okay, so a little bit different than muscles there. However, they have the same types of stripes or striations that skeletal muscle cells have, which means their basic underlying structures can be very similar. Okay? However, unlike skeletal muscles, they are involuntary, and thankfully so. So your heart beats whether you tell it to or not. This means that you can fall asleep and be unconscious, and your heart will keep going. You don't have to tell it to beat. Okay, so it's involuntary. They have these connections called intercalated discs between the different cells. These intercalated discs contain desmosomes. So if you remember back to the cell chapter, we talked about desmosomes. So these were junctions that held cells together. And then they also have gap junctions, which allowed for communication between the cells. And that's going to be very important in your heart, because you want very quick communication so the cells can all contract sort of in a wave-like fashion, pushing blood out of the heart. The last type of muscle type is smooth muscle. So the shape of these it's what's known as spindle shaped, meaning that it's wider in the middle and it tapers at the end. It reminds me of like if you have Play-Doh or something, you're just kind of rolling it, it tapers at the end, it's wider in the middle. Again, it follows the rule of one cell, one nucleus. However, it has a smooth appearance, meaning that it does not have those striations in it, which means that the way that it's going to contract and the underlying structure is going to be different than the cardiac as well as skeletal muscles. This will line the walls of hollow organs, so things that are hollow are things like your blood vessels, because they'll have blood inside of them. GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, again, is hollow in the middle, as well as your bladder, so other things can fill it up. Again, they're involuntary. You do not have to tell your gastrointestinal tract to move food through it. It just does it. Okay. You don't have to tell in fact, you don't tell your blood vessels to contract or expand. They kind of just do it. I mean, do you ever try not to blush? No, it just happens, and you're embarrassed, right? Your bladder, you have different, you do have some voluntary muscle around the exit point of your bladder, so you do have control as to whether or not you're going to empty your bladder, thankfully so. However, there are other parts of the bladder, it just simply expands all by itself to provide greater volume for urine storage. Okay. So again, it's involuntary, not striated. All right. So nervous tissue, we have two different principal types of tissue, and we will get into much greater detail at the very end of 201 on nervous tissue. So again, just very briefly, neurons are the main nerve cells. So again, nerve cells are called neurons. These guys are so specialized in their functions, they basically can't take care of themselves. They can't. They have to have other cells help take care of them. And in fact, they do. They have a whole slew of different cells that are helping take care of them, the support cells, and we call those helper cells neuroglia. So in nerve tissue, here's a big neuron, so it's very large, and then here you can see the nuclei of all these little neuroglia cells, all these support cells that are helping this single large neuron. Okay. So you have a central nucleus, you have a cell body, and then you have these long processes coming off. We call the ones that receive information dendrites. So these processes that are receiving information are called dendrites. And then the projection that is sending information to some other structure, that other structure can be a nerve or a muscle or gland, it can be anything. But that process that's sending information is called an axon. So incoming information is dendrite, outgoing information is axon. Okay. So again, dendrite signal is traveling toward the cell body, axon is traveling away from it. Okay, and then that is the end of chapter 4. So hopefully that was good and informative and is also going to help you in lab and on that lab practical. Don't forget to take the quiz, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in lab. And if not, you can always email me if you don't have any questions. As well. All right. See you next time.